There are two ways for a man to try to outlive himself, and they are almost exactly opposed. The first is to acquire the hardest substances the earth produces, cut them, mount them, and attach a name to them so that the name travels forward through the centuries inside objects that cannot be scratched, burned, or dissolved. The second is to take ordinary sand, melt it, color it with metal oxides, and press it into shapes that hold light for as long as nobody drops them. One man in 19th century New York did the first of those things with an aggression that made him the most famous merchant in America. His son, who grew up in the rooms above the shop, spent his entire adult life doing the second, and spent a considerable portion of it explaining why. They had the same surname. They died 31 years apart. The father's business is still trading today, under the name he put above the door. The son's business went bankrupt in the Depression, and the house he had built burned to its foundations on a Long Island hillside 24 years after he was buried. And yet almost every object either of them touched that a museum would now fight to own was made by the son. The father was called Charles Lewis Tiffany. He was born in a Connecticut mill village in the winter of 1812, in a household where money was counted, and he was not a man given to explaining himself. The son was Louis Comfort Tiffany, born 36 years later in New York City, into a household where money was no longer counted at all. What passed between them is one of the least examined and most revealing conflicts of the Gilded Age. It was not a feud in the theatrical sense. There was no disinheritance, no public denunciation, no scene. There was something quieter and more corrosive, a father who had spent his life proving that beauty was a commodity, and a son who devoted his to insisting that it was not, both of them funded by the same fortune, both of them working in the same city for 30 years, on opposite sides of a question neither ever conceded. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. This is the story of how the most recognizable luxury name in the world was built by a man who understood exactly what people would pay for permanence, and inherited by a man who spent it all on light. The village was called Killingly, in the eastern hills of Connecticut, and it ran on cotton. Charles Lewis Tiffany was born there on the 15th of February, 1812, the son of Comfort Tiffany, who manufactured cotton goods, and Chloe Draper. The family traced itself back to an English settler who had arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the middle of the 1600s, which in New England mattered a great deal and paid nothing. The father was not poor. He owned a mill and a small general store, and by the standards of a Connecticut mill village, he was a substantial man. But the household was of a particular kind, the kind that produced a very great many of the men who later built the American fortunes. Comfortable, Protestant, arithmetically minded, and entirely without softness on the subject of work. Charles was put behind the counter of his father's store at 15. He was educated at the district school and at an academy in the neighboring town, and afterwards he was set to work in the office of the cotton factory. It was, in the ordinary course of things, a life laid out in full. He would run the mill, marry locally, and die within 20 miles of where he was born. He was 25 when he decided against it. In the autumn of 1837, with a school friend named John Young and $1,000 borrowed from his father, Charles Lewis Tiffany opened a small shop on Broadway in New York City, selling stationery and what the period called fancy goods. The timing was, on the face of it, catastrophic. The country was in the opening months of a financial panic that would flatten American credit 4 years. Banks were suspending payments. Businesses were closing along the whole length of Lower Broadway. The company's own history records that the takings on the first day came to less than $5. There is a version of this story that treats the beginning as charming. The modest counter, the derisory first receipts, the boy from Connecticut. What that version omits is that the two young men had chosen precisely the right business for a depression. In a collapsing market, the trade in small, beautiful objects does not die. It consolidates. The people who still have money in a panic are the people who had a great deal of it beforehand, and they continue to buy. What Tiffany understood almost immediately, and what separated him from every other importer of curiosities on Broadway, was that the goods themselves mattered less than the terms on which they were sold. He would not haggle. This was, in 1837 America, close to revolutionary. Retail was a negotiation. Every price was an opening position. A customer's dignity was routinely spent in the transaction. Tiffany put a fixed price on every article and refused to move from it. He also refused credit and dealt strictly in cash. The effect of those two decisions was not primarily commercial. It was social. A shop where the price is fixed and the terms are the same for everyone is a shop where a woman may enter unaccompanied and buy without being cheated, and where a newly enriched family from the western states can spend money without exposing their ignorance to a salesman. He had removed humiliation from the purchase of luxury, and in a country that was in the process of manufacturing thousands of people with new money and no confidence, that was worth more than any object on the shelves. He also understood from the very beginning that what he was really selling was information. The assurance that the thing was what it was said to be. A pearl was a pearl. A silver spoon contained the quantity of silver claimed for it. In a market saturated with plated goods and paste stones, the guarantee was the entire product. Within a few years, the partnership had taken on a third man, J.L. Ellis, whose capital allowed them to take the adjoining room and double the floor space, and whose knowledge of the European trade sent him across the Atlantic on buying journeys. The firm became Tiffany, Young, and Ellis. It began importing Bohemian glass, Chinese porcelain, Indian bronzes, and French novelties, bought directly off the ships as they came into New York and Boston harbors, ahead of every competitor in the city. By the middle of the 1840s, they had abandoned costume jewelry altogether and turned to the real thing. In 1845, the firm issued a catalog of its wares, bound in blue, the first retail catalog of its kind in the United States, and the ancestor of every luxury mailing that has landed on a doormat since. And then in 1848, the fortune arrived from an entirely unexpected direction. It arrived out of a revolution. In February of that year, the throne of France fell. Louis-Philippe abdicated and left for England, and within days, the aristocracy of Paris was doing what aristocracies do at such moments, which is to convert everything portable into cash and leave. The firm's buyer was in Paris. The details of what happened next vary between the tellings, and the company's own retelling has grown considerably in the retelling, but the substance is not disputed. As the great houses of the Faubourg emptied, Tiffany's man bought diamonds from frightened people at prices that would never be seen again. The stones came back to New York. This was the making of the business, and it was the making of Charles Louis Tiffany, but the reason it worked had almost nothing to do with the stones and everything to do with what they meant. America in 1848 had no aristocracy and a very acute awareness of the fact. It was regarded in Europe as a nation of farmers, speculators, and frontiersmen. The arrival in a Broadway shop of jewels that had, weeks earlier, been worn at a French court was not a commercial event. It was a national one. The press understood it before the customers did. The proprietor was given a title, and it stuck to him for the remaining 54 years of his life. The King of Diamonds. He moved with great speed after that. In 1850, he opened a branch in Paris, an American jeweler with a shop in the city that defined the trade, which was a piece of effrontery that Europeans found difficult to forgive. In 1851, he brought the silversmith John Moore's firm under his own roof as an exclusive supplier and adopted the English standard of silver purity, 92.5 parts in 100, for everything he sold. The word that came with that standard was sterling, and it entered ordinary American speech through his counter. In 1853, he bought out his partners and put his own name alone above the door. What followed was 30 years of the most sophisticated publicity campaign that American retail had yet seen, conducted by a man who never gave a speech and rarely gave an interview. He supplied a jeweled carriage for the wedding of one of the celebrated performers of the age, in partnership with the showman who managed him, and the newspapers printed it everywhere. When the first telegraph cable was laid across the Atlantic in 1858 and then failed within weeks, Tiffany acquired the surplus, cut it into short lengths, mounted them, and sold them as souvenirs at 50 cents apiece. The crowd that came for them was large enough that the police were called to hold the line on Broadway. Consider what that actually was. He had taken a piece of failed industrial rope and sold it to ordinary New Yorkers as a relic of the future. It was the first time an American merchant had understood that the story attached to an object could be the object. Then came the war, and the war was extremely good to him. Between 1861 and 1865, the firm manufactured swords, badges, medals, flags, and surgical instruments for the Union Army, and allowed its premises to be used as a depot for military supplies. There is nothing hidden about this and nothing unusual about it. A great many Northern fortunes were consolidated in those 4 years by men who sold to the government. But it is worth registering because it is the part of the story that the blue box does not carry. The house that would come to stand for engagement rings and wedding silver was capitalized, in significant part, by the equipping of an army. After the war, the reputation went international. At the Paris Exposition of 1867, the firm took a medal for its silver, the first time a jury in Europe had honored an American house in the decorative arts, and a moment that was reported in the United States as a kind of vindication. The French made him a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. The Russian court sent him a decoration. He was appointed jeweler to a startling number of crowned heads for a man born in a Connecticut mill village. And in the late 1870s came the stone that settled the matter permanently. It had been dug out of the Kimberley mine in South Africa, a rough yellow diamond of 287 and a fraction carats, the largest of its color then known. Tiffany bought it for $18,000 and sent it to Paris. The cutting was overseen by a young gemologist newly arrived at the firm, George Frederick Kunz, who was then in his early 20s and would go on to spend more than half a century as the house's chief gem buyer, and who studied the stone for a year before a single facet was ground. What Kunz did with it was unorthodox. A brilliant cut of the period carried 58 facets. He gave it more than 80, sacrificing size for depth of color, so that the finished stone, a shade over 128 carats, appeared to hold fire in its interior. And then Charles Louis Tiffany did the single cleverest thing of his commercial life. He refused to sell it. The stone was named after him. It was displayed, lent to exhibitions, shown at World's Fairs, and never in the whole subsequent history of the firm put on the market. It was not merchandise. It was proof, a permanent, portable demonstration that an American shopkeeper could hold something no European house had. 9 years later, when the Third Republic decided to auction off what remained of the French crown jewels, he sent his buyers to Paris and acquired roughly a third of the sale, more than any other bidder in the room. There is a legend attached to this period, and it needs marking as a legend. The story, repeated for well over a century in profiles of the firm, holds that among the pieces Charles Tiffany bought was a diamond necklace that had belonged to Marie Antoinette. It is one of the most persistent items in the company's own mythology. It is also, according to the firm's later design director, who went into the matter, not true. The necklace in question was designed but never actually made. The legend has outlived the correction by several decades, which is exactly what legends attached to famous names tend to do. Set the correction aside and the achievement remains extraordinary. Within a single working lifetime, a man from a cotton village had made his surname the American word for a certain kind of quality, had persuaded the newly rich of an entire continent that his judgment could be substituted for their own, and had done it by selling things that do not decay. By the 1880s, when a New York family wished to signal that it had arrived, it did not commission a portrait. It went to Union Square, and it came back with a small parcel. Behind the shop there was a household, and the household is where the other half of this story begins. On the 30th of November, 1841, Charles Louis Tiffany married Harriet Olivia Avery Young. She was the sister of John Young, his first partner, a pattern that recurs constantly in the commercial families of the period, in which the firm and the family are simply two descriptions of the same set of people. They had 6 children. The one who matters to this story was born in New York on the 18th of February, 1848, the same year that the diamonds came out of Paris, and was given the names Louis Comfort, the second of them his grandfather's, the cotton manufacturer of Killingly. He grew up inside the most rapid social ascent available in 19th century America. In the year of his birth, his father was a Broadway shopkeeper of good reputation. By the time the boy was 20, his father was the king of diamonds, decorated by two European powers, with premises on Union Square in a Paris branch. Louis Comfort Tiffany never experienced the family's rise. He experienced only its results. That distinction is the whole of the story. The first generation of a fortune knows what money is for because it remembers being without it. The second generation is handed the finished condition and is expected to be grateful for a struggle it did not have. Almost every dynasty in this series contains, somewhere in it, the moment when a son looks at what his father built and declines to admire it, and the fathers are almost always genuinely astonished. Louis was sent to military academies, first in New Jersey and afterwards in Pennsylvania, which was a conventional choice for a boy of his class and a comprehensively unsuitable one for this particular boy. He was not academic. He was not, by any account that survives, obedient. What he did possess from very early was a highly unusual eye. He announced when his education finished that he did not intend to enter the family business. He intended to paint. It is difficult to convey how that would have landed in a Union Square household in the 1860s. It was not that painting was disreputable. His father was, in fact, a serious patron of the arts, a founder of the New York Society of Fine Arts, and a supporter of the Metropolitan Museum. Charles Louis Tiffany bought pictures. He simply understood art the way he understood a diamond, as an object of documented value that a knowledgeable man acquires. What he could not accommodate was a son who wanted to make it. The refusal was, in its way, an extremely expensive act of freedom, and it should be said plainly that it was underwritten from the first day. Louis Comfort Tiffany never had to sell a painting to eat. He studied in New York under the landscape painter George Inness, and afterwards with Samuel Coleman, and then went to Paris, and then traveled through Spain and across into North Africa, which was the journey that changed him. What he brought back from that journey was not a technique, it was a color problem. He had seen in the tiled interiors and the mosques, in the filtered light of the Maghreb, color used structurally rather than descriptively, color that was not applied to a surface to represent something, but was the surface and changed with the hour. Western easel painting could not do that. It could only depict light. It could not contain it. He painted for the better part of a decade, exhibited, was elected to the National Academy of Design, and was regarded as a perfectly respectable minor American landscape and Orientalist painter. He was, by his own later account, dissatisfied throughout. It has to be admitted at this point that we are working largely from the shape of the evidence rather than from the evidence itself. There is no letter in which Charles Louis Tiffany tells his son that painting is a waste of a life. There is no recorded quarrel, no scene at a dinner table, no witness account of a confrontation. The founder was, by every description that survives, a contained man who conducted his affairs in short sentences and left almost nothing personal behind. A biographer looking for the moment the two of them fell out will not find one because there almost certainly was not one. What there is instead is a pattern of actions, sustained over 40 years, and the pattern is unambiguous. The father never gave his son a role in the business he had built, at any point in either of their lifetimes. Louis did not enter the firm at 20 or 30 or 40 or 50. He entered it at 54 in the year his father died, and not before, in a period when American commercial dynasties routinely installed sons in the counting house at 18 and made them partners at 25. That is not an oversight. It is a settled arrangement that both parties evidently preferred. At the same time, the money never stopped. The travel, the studios, the experiments in glass, the decorating partnership, the Corona furnaces, all of it was made possible by a fortune the son had done nothing to earn and spent his life implicitly criticizing. Charles Louis Tiffany funded, without any recorded complaint, a 40-year demonstration that his own values were insufficient. That is a more interesting relationship than a feud, and a considerably more common one. It is the arrangement of two people who love each other, understand each other perfectly, disagree fundamentally, and settle on a treaty in which nothing is ever said aloud. And there is a further complication that no account of this family should skip. When the son finally did something the father could genuinely admire, a building, a commission, a firm with employees, and a payroll, he was doing it in his father's manner and not his own. Louis Comfort Tiffany was not, in the end, a solitary artist. He was a proprietor, a man who assembled 150 people, a factory, a brand, an export trade, and a design signature, and ran them for 30 years. Whatever he had rejected, it was not the family aptitude. By the middle of the 1870s, he had begun spending his time in the glass houses of Brooklyn. The problem he set himself in 1875 was, in technical terms, a heresy. Stained glass in the Western tradition had worked in essentially the same way since the 12th century. Sheets of colored glass were cut to shape, assembled in lead, and then the detail, a face, a fold of cloth, the shading of a hand, was painted onto the surface in vitreous enamel and fired. The glass provided the color. The painter provided the picture. Tiffany's proposition was that the painting was a confession of failure. If the glass itself carried the modulation, if a single sheet could shift from violet to green across its width, if it could be rippled, folded, streaked, and pressed into texture while molten, then the window would not be a painting lit from behind. It would be an object made of light. He was not alone in this. The American artist John Lafarge was working the same territory at the same moment, and the question of who arrived first at opalescent window glass was contested at the time and has remained slightly contested since. What is not in dispute is that within a few years, Tiffany had patented his own process and had begun assembling something Lafarge never attempted, which was an industry. By the end of the 1870s, he had glassmaking underway in Queens. In 1879, he formed a decorating partnership with three others: the textile designer Candace Wheeler, his old teacher Samuel Coleman, and Lockwood DeForest, who supplied carved Indian woodwork, under the name Associated Artists. They lasted 4 years and defined a decade. The proposition was total interior design at a moment when American wealth had suddenly acquired enormous houses and no idea what to put in them. Associated Artists would do everything: wallpapers, textiles, furniture, ceilings, tiles, glass. A client did not buy objects. A client bought a coherent world delivered by 4 people with taste. In 1881, they decorated the Hartford house of Mark Twain, and that interior survives, and anyone who wants to understand what the firm was selling can still walk through it. And in 1882 came the commission that made Louis Comfort Tiffany a national name at the age of 34. President Chester Arthur had come to the office by way of an assassination, had inherited a White House he found charmless, and announced that he would not move in until it had been redecorated. It is a detail that says a great deal about Arthur, who was a man of considerable personal vanity and excellent tailoring, and it is the reason the young Tiffany was handed the staterooms of the American Republic. He worked through the East Room, the Blue Room, the Red Room, the State Dining Room, and the Entrance Hall, repainting in dense decorative patterns, replacing mantelpieces, hanging heavily figured papers, fitting glass into the gas fixtures. And across the entrance hall, from floor to ceiling, he set a screen of opalescent glass. Descriptions of it survive, and they agree on the effect. The hall was permanently iridescent, washed in crimson, cobalt, and a dozen shades of white, changing as the daylight moved. It was the boldest thing anyone had done to that building, and for 19 years it was among the most famous objects in the United States. The father, meanwhile, was at the height of his powers and had solved the problem of his son in the only way available to him, which was to give him a department. He had taken his own firm to the top of the trade by then. In 1886, he introduced a mounting for a diamond ring that lifted the stone clear of the band on 6 slender prongs so that light could enter it from every direction instead of being smothered in a bezel. It was called the Tiffany setting, and it is, without exaggeration, the reason a modern engagement ring looks the way it does. Almost nobody who buys one has any idea that it was designed as an optical solution. And a year later, he took a third of the French crown jewels. Look at the two men in the 1880s, and the symmetry is almost too neat to be real. The father is engineering a mount that will admit the greatest possible quantity of light and into a stone that will never change. The son is building a wall of glass that has no purpose except to alter the light in a room, and that will last as long as nobody breaks it. They were working on precisely the same problem from the opposite end, and there is no evidence that either of them ever said so. The glass houses were at Corona in Queens, and what came out of them in the 1890s is the reason the name means what it means. Working with an English glassworker named Arthur Nash, Tiffany developed a technique for combining colors in the molten state, mixing them while the glass was still liquid so that the gradations were internal rather than applied, and treating the surface with metallic vapors to produce an iridescence like the sheen on a beetle's wing or on glass that has been buried for 1,000 years. He named it favrile, from an old word meaning made by hand, and he registered it. The 90s were his great decade. In 1893, for the World's Fair at Chicago, he built an entire chapel, mosaic columns, a suspended cross of glass and pearls, an interior of Byzantine density that visitors reported having to sit down inside. It was, for a great many Americans, the first sight of what he could do at scale, and it made him internationally famous within a season. The chapel was bought afterwards for the crypt of a New York cathedral, fell into disuse there as the building works dragged on, and was eventually removed by Tiffany himself and carried off to his own house on Long Island, which tells its own story about how he regarded his work. At the Paris Exposition of 1900, his glass took the highest honors available, and the European critics, who had spent a century patronizing American decorative art, were reduced to describing an American as the leading figure of an international style. It is worth being clear about what actually paid for all of this, because the exhibitions and the expositions were the visible part of an operation whose foundations lay somewhere far less glamorous. The business of Tiffany Studios was churches. Across the last quarter of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th, the United States built houses of worship at a rate no country has managed before or since. Episcopal, Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, Catholic, Congregational, in every town of any size in the Republic. And into a very large number of them went memorial windows, glass paid for by a family, installed in a wall, carrying the name of a dead relative at the foot of the image. That was the product. A grieving widow in Ohio or Pennsylvania or upstate New York, with a certain amount of money and a wish to make her husband's death permanent, could commission from a New York studio a window in which the light of every Sunday morning for a century would pass through an angel, a river, a stand of trees, and her husband's name. It is precisely the same transaction Charles Louis Tiffany had built his shop on, the purchase of permanence in the face of death, conducted at a different altar, in a different material, by his son. There were thousands of them. They went into cathedrals and into clapboard churches in towns of 200 people. Whole industrial cities acquired dozens apiece. The catalogs of surviving Tiffany windows compiled by scholars in the 20th century run to hundreds of entries and are known to be incomplete because a great many were installed in buildings that have since been demolished, deconsecrated, sold, or quietly stripped. Those commissions, repeated across 4 decades, financed the furnaces, the experiments, the exhibitions, the Paris medals, and eventually the house on Long Island. The lamps, which are what the name now means to most people, were in commercial terms a sideline, profitable, fashionable, and secondary to the steady business of memorializing the American dead. And behind all of it, in a workroom on the upper floors, there were 27 women. The women's glass cutting department at Tiffany Studios came into existence, according to the standard account of the firm, out of a labor dispute. The men's glaziers union had gone out. Women were barred from joining it and could therefore be employed in its place. That is the unromantic origin usually given for one of the most consequential design workshops in American history. Whatever set it up, what it became was something the period had almost no vocabulary for. A department of skilled women, doing creative rather than clerical work, inside a major manufacturing concern, at a moment when the overwhelming majority of American women in paid employment were in domestic service, textiles, or teaching. They selected the glass. That phrase understates it considerably. A leaded shade of 2,000 pieces required somebody to walk the racks of the Corona Works, hold sheets against the light, and choose from a stock of thousands of variations of color, density, ripple, and streak, which fragment of which sheet would sit at which point in a wisteria, so that the finished object read as a tree in flower, rather than as a mosaic of purple. The cutting followed a pattern. The choosing was the design. And in several of the other women's departments, the enamels, the pottery, the work went further still. Into media, the firm regarded as experimental and unprofitable, in which the woman who ran the glass department described in her letters, with obvious envy, as a little Arcadia. The person who ran it was called Clara Driscoll. She was born in Tallmadge, Ohio, in the winter of 1861, one of four sisters in a family that, unusually for the period, encouraged all of them into higher education. She came to New York to finish her art training in 1888 and joined Tiffany in the same year. Her department did the work that the popular account has always attributed to one man. The women selected the glass, matched it, cut it, and fitted it to the molds. There were rules attached to the arrangement, and one of them mattered enormously. A woman who married had to leave. Driscoll left twice for that reason and came back both times, once when a fiancé disappeared before the wedding, and finally in 1909 when she married and did not return. In between, over roughly 2 decades, she designed more than 30 of the lamps, not assembled, designed. The Dragonfly, which took a medal at the Paris Exposition of 1900. The Wisteria, which when it went into production a few years later was among the most expensive and most sought-after objects the studios made. The Peony, the Daffodil, which appears from the record to have been the first. She was, according to the research that has been done on the firm's pay, among the highest-earning women in America. And for almost a century, none of this was known. The company's literature credited the designs to Louis Comfort Tiffany, without qualification, without departments, without names. There was one exception at the Paris Exposition, where Driscoll was identified as the designer of the Dragonfly shade in the contemporary reports. Otherwise, the attribution was total and it was uniform. And when the studios collapsed in the 1930s, their business records were destroyed, which appeared to close the question permanently. What reopened it was a family archive. In the opening years of this century, several separate caches of Clara Driscoll's letters, written over a decade and more to her mother and her sisters in Ohio, surfaced independently. A relative approached one scholar. An independent researcher found a second collection in a historical society in Queens. A third turned up in an archive in Ohio. The researchers, who had been working without knowledge of each other, converged on the same material and then on each other. The letters are not artistic manifestos. They are ordinary correspondence about boarding house life, wages, sisters, weather, and work. And scattered through the work are sentences of a kind that art historians almost never get to read. Descriptions of a design being conceived on a particular day by the person writing the letter. In one of them, she records having had an idea for a dragonfly lamp. The exhibition that followed at the New York Historical Society in 2007 did something that is genuinely rare. It did not merely add a name to a label, it reframed the entire firm. What had been understood as the singular vision of one man was revealed as a studio. Dozens of designers, many of them women, working under a proprietor who reviewed the designs weekly, approved them, praised them privately, and put his own name on all of them. It is necessary to be fair to him here, because the temptation to make this a simple morality tale is strong, and the evidence does not support it. By the standards of 1890s manufacture, Tiffany's treatment of Driscoll was not exploitative in the crude sense. He paid her extremely well. He met her regularly. The letters record that he admired her, told her so, and gave her department real autonomy. The two of them shared a genuine aesthetic, a preoccupation with plants, insects, water, and light that runs through everything the studios produced. The attribution was not personal malice. It was the ordinary commercial practice of the period, in which a workshop spoke with the voice of its principal, exactly as a Renaissance painter's studio had. But there is an irony in it that is impossible to look away from. Louis Comfort Tiffany had spent his youth in flight from a father who understood beauty as an object with a name attached to it, a man who put his own surname on a diamond he had merely purchased and made that act the foundation of a fortune. Lewis rejected the shop, rejected the trade, rejected the whole logic of the blue box. And then he built a workshop in which more than 100 people made things and put his own name on every single one of them. He had escaped his father's business entirely. He had reproduced his father's method exactly. 1902 was the pivot of both lives, and it managed to be a triumph and a demolition within a few months of each other. On the 18th of February, 3 days after his 90th birthday, Charles Louis Tiffany died of pneumonia. He had been active in the firm to nearly the end. He had run it for 65 years, from a stationary counter taking under $5 a day to an institution that had become, by common consent, the most important jewelry house in North America. The estate was reported at a figure in the region of $35 million, which at the time was a fraction of the entire national product, large enough to be worth calculating. His son, at 54, was appointed the firm's first design director. Read that appointment carefully because it is more complicated than it appears. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a surrender. Lewis had spent 30 years demonstrating that he would not sell jewelry, and he now took, without apparent hesitation, the one position in the company that would allow him to make it. He was not going to stand behind the counter. He was going to decide what was on it. For a man of his temperament, that was not a betrayal of the position he had taken at 20. It was a vindication of it. And in the same year in Washington, the other thing happened. Theodore Roosevelt had arrived in the White House the previous autumn, also by way of an assassination, and he detested Victorian clutter with the completeness of a man who had decided the century was over. He brought in the architects of the moment to strip the building back to a colonial revival severity, and everything of the 1880s went. The screen of opalescent glass, which had stood across the entrance hall for 19 years, was dismantled and sent to auction. It was bought by the proprietor of a Maryland resort hotel, installed there, and is presumed to have been destroyed when that hotel burned down 2 decades later. So in the space of a single year, Louis Comfort Tiffany inherited his father's throne and lost his own most celebrated work, pulled out of a public building by a president who considered it embarrassing. It was the first clear signal of the thing that would define the rest of his life, and he did not read it. The tide of taste had turned. He had another 30 years, and the whole of it would be spent making, with undiminished conviction and enormous expenditure, objects that the world was in the process of deciding it no longer wanted. What he did with his father's shop, however, deserves a chapter of its own, because it is the closest thing to an answer he ever gave. For 65 years, Tiffany & Company had been organized around a single proposition, which was that the value of a jewel is the value of its materials, authenticated by the house. Charles Louis Tiffany had built the entire enterprise on the colorless diamond, the graded pearl, the weight ounce of sterling. The Tiffany setting existed to display a stone. The Tiffany diamond existed to prove that the firm could obtain the best one in the world. Every mechanism of the business, from the fixed price to the blue catalog, was designed to reassure a customer that what they were buying could be independently valued. His son took charge of the design and proceeded with perfect courtesy to dismantle that principle from the inside. He established an artistic jewelry department in the Fifth Avenue store, and he staffed it to make objects in which the materials were subordinate to the design. He worked closely with George Frederick Kunz, the gemologist his father had hired half a century earlier, but he did not ask him for diamonds. He asked for sapphires out of Montana, green garnets, tourmalines from the quarries of Maine, Mexican fire opals, black opals, and American pearls of irregular Baroque shapes that a conventional jeweler would have rejected as flawed. Colorless stones were very nearly ignored. What came out of the department were brooches shaped as dragonflies, necklaces of enameled grapevine with opals hanging as fruit, berries of garnet on leaves of green enamel, pieces conceived by a painter, in which the gem was chosen for its hue and its behavior in light, exactly as a sheet of glass would be chosen for a window. He showed them publicly for the first time at the Great Exposition in St. Louis in 1904, and they were awarded honors. Consider the position from the shop floor. The most famous diamond house in America was now being directed by a man who did not particularly care about diamonds, who preferred a stone from a Maine quarry to one from Kimberley if the color was better, and who priced by design rather than by carat. The firm's long-serving jewelry designer, a man of impeccably classical taste who had run the artistic side for the best part of 2 decades, found himself sharing authority with him. It was not a rebellion, because nobody framed it as one. Louis Comfort Tiffany served the company for 17 years, was promoted twice, and retired from the position at the end of the First World War. The diamond trade went on entirely undisturbed around him. The artistic jewelry was a department, not a policy, and it was never more than a small fraction of the turnover. But it was, unmistakably, an answer. Given the keys to the greatest gem business in the Western Hemisphere, the Sun used them to argue that the gems were the least interesting part. There were 2 marriages, and both of them ended with a widower. On the 15th of May, 1872, at Norwich in Connecticut, Louis Comfort Tiffany married Mary Woodbridge Goddard. He was 24 and had been painting for 4 years. She was of much the same New England background as his mother, a world of congregational churches, cousins, and settled money. And there is nothing in the record to suggest the marriage was anything other than affectionate. They had 4 children. The eldest, another Mary, was born in 1873 and would live to be 90. Then came a son in 1878, given the names Charles Louis after his grandfather. Then Hilda, born in 1879, who did not live to see 30, and in 1884, Mary Goddard died. Louis Comfort Tiffany was 36 years old, with 3 young children, in the middle of the most successful period of his career to that date. It is at exactly this point that his father did something that has to be read twice to be understood. 2 years earlier, Charles Louis Tiffany had bought land on the northwest corner of Madison Avenue and 72nd Street, at that date an almost empty stretch of the Upper East Side, well away from the Fifth Avenue frontage where the newly rich were building, and engaged the young architectural firm of McKim, Mead, and White to put up a house on it. It was not to be a house in the ordinary sense. It was to be a single enormous structure containing separate apartments for the whole family, so that the Tiffanys who had scattered across Manhattan could be gathered back under one roof. And having commissioned it, the founder handed the design of it to his son. Louis took the project over almost completely. He worked with Stanford White, whom he knew well, and produced elevations at the firm, in a commission unlike any other in its history, very largely accepted. The result was a vast, dark, fortress-like pile of brick and sandstone, part Romanesque and part something without a name, one of the largest private dwellings ever built in New York and, by the judgment of the trade press of the day, the most conspicuous house in the city. It was completed in 1885, the year after Mary Goddard died. Now consider what that commission actually was. A father who had spent 2 decades refusing to take his son's vocation seriously spent an enormous sum putting up a building on the explicit condition that his son design it. There is no letter that explains it. There is no recorded conversation. It is the single most generous thing Charles Louis Tiffany is known to have done for Louis, and it took the form of a house, which is the only language he had. What happened next is stranger still. The founder does not appear to have taken up residence in it in any settled way. He kept to his existing address further down Madison Avenue, and the lower floors of the great new building were let to a tenant. The apartment that mattered, the studio at the top, with its extraordinary ceilings and its hanging fireplace and its accumulation of glass, belonged to the son. Louis Comfort Tiffany lived in it for nearly half a century and died in it. The house intended to reunite the family became, in practice, a monument to the distance inside it. In November 1886, he married again. Louise Wakeman Knox was of his own circle and his own age. They had 4 more children in rapid succession, twin daughters in 1887, a third daughter, and finally in 1891, a fourth, named Dorothy. 8 children in total, then across 2 marriages, in the loudest household in New York. Almost nothing is written about them, and that absence is itself informative. The Tiffany children grew up inside an interior their father had designed as a total work of art and were, so far as the record shows, kept at the edges of it. Several of the daughters made conventional marriages into professional New York families. One son took his grandfather's name and, in the end, his grandfather's chair, serving the jewelry firm into the middle of the next century. Only the youngest went somewhere nobody expected. Dorothy Tiffany left New York for Vienna, trained in the new discipline of psychoanalysis, worked for decades in child analysis, and spent the greater part of her adult life in the closest possible professional and personal partnership with Anna Freud. She lived until 1979. She is, by a considerable margin, the most historically consequential of Louis Comfort Tiffany's descendants. And there is a certain justice in the fact that she is the one who left the house entirely. In 1904, Louise Wakeman Knox Tiffany died. Louis was 56, widowed twice, and he did not marry again. What he did instead was build. The land was at Cold Spring Harbor on the north shore of Long Island, on a bluff above the water, and he began work on it around the time of his father's death. Laurelton Hall took some 3 years to complete and cost, by later estimate, in the region of $2 million. It had 84 rooms, it sat in 600 acres, and it was not, in any recognizable sense, a Gilded Age country house. There were no columns, no French rooms, no ballroom in the Newport manner, none of the architectural quotation with which the American rich were then announcing that they had read a book about Europe. Tiffany designed the whole of it himself, and what he designed was closer to a Persian or Moorish idea of a dwelling than to anything on Long Island. Low, spreading, wrapped around courtyards, organized around water. Water ran through the house. There were fountains inside it. The entrance court held a glass hanging in a shaft of light. On the terrace, columns rose 11 feet and terminated in capitals of glass daffodils, not carved to resemble flowers, but made of glass petals, so that the load-bearing structure of a building was topped with something that would shatter. The windows were his own, in their hundreds. The mosaics were his. The furniture, the fittings, the lamps, the ceramics, the gardens, the plantings, and the routing of the paths were all his. The chapel he had built for the Chicago Fair in 1893, the one that had been bought for a cathedral crypt and then neglected there, he reclaimed and installed at Laurelton in 1916. It has been called a house. It is more accurate to call it an argument. Everything Charles Louis Tiffany had believed about beauty was contained in the phrase permanent value. Everything at Laurelton Hall was designed on the opposite principle, that beauty is a condition of light and season and hour, that it changes through the day, that it is by nature fragile, and that the fragility is not a defect to be engineered out, but the whole of the point. The son had spent his father's money building a 70-year refutation of his father's philosophy on a hilltop in glass. He entertained there on a scale that is now difficult to imagine. The most famous of the entertainments came in 1913, when he staged an elaborate Egyptian pageant with costumes, tableau, and a company of performers for several hundred guests of the New York art world. Photographs survive. It reads today as somewhere between a mask and a piece of installation art, and it was, by every account, the high water mark of his public presence. He was 65. He had another 20 years, and the whole of the current was already turning against him. There is a temptation to file Laurelton Hall alongside the other great follies of the American rich, the Newport cottages, the ranch castles, the imported cloisters, and it does not belong there. The Gilded Age Palace was, almost without exception, an argument about status. It borrowed a European vocabulary in order to say that the owner's family now belonged among people who had held land for 600 years. It was a claim made in stone by men who were anxious. Tiffany borrowed nothing that anyone in Newport would have recognized, and he was not making a claim about his family. He had, in a sense, the opposite problem. His family's name was already on the most prestigious shop in America, and he had spent his whole life declining to stand behind its counter. What Laurelton Hall asserted was not that its owner was as good as a duke. It asserted that a building could be a work of art in the same sense that a painting is, that the arrangement of colored light in a room is a compositional act, and that a house designed on that principle is a more serious object than a house that merely quotes a chateau. It was, in other words, a theory of beauty built at full scale on 600 acres by a man who had inherited enough money to test it, and it was tested. The verdict, arriving over the following 20 years, was that nobody agreed with him. There is one more figure in the Laurelton story, and she arrived in the plainest possible way. In 1910, Louis Comfort Tiffany fell seriously ill with a kidney infection, and a nurse was sent out from New York to the estate to look after him. Her name was Sarah Eileen Hanley. She had been born in Sligo in 1883, had emigrated to the United States in her early 20s, and had trained in New York. She was 35 years his junior. She stayed for 23 years. What exactly the relationship was has been described in a variety of ways by a variety of people, and the honest answer is that the documents do not settle it. What is documented is this. He built her a house of her own on the grounds adjoining his. She became a painter under his encouragement, exhibited in New York galleries in the 1930s, and was elected to a professional association of women artists. When he established his foundation, she was its first director. When he died, she inherited her house and a share of his estate, and she remained on that hillside for the rest of her life. The foundation was the last large act of his working life, and it was, on the evidence, entirely sincere. He set it up in 1918 at the age of 70 and gave it Laurelton Hall. The purpose was to bring young artists and craftspeople to the estate each summer to live and work there at his expense, with the run of the gardens, the collections, and the glass. It was the first organization of its kind in the United States, and the first anywhere to be endowed by a living artist for the benefit of other artists. Rate against the rest of his life, it is the most revealing thing he ever did. Because what Louis Comfort Tiffany had never had, for all the money, all the commissions, all the international medals, was a father who took his vocation seriously. He had been supported financially and dismissed intellectually. He had been given a house to design and never, so far as anybody knows, told that the work was worth doing for its own sake. So at 70, he built an institution whose entire function was to tell young artists precisely that. He also, in the same period, retired as design director of Tiffany & Company and turned back to his glass. And the tide, which had been going out since 1902, now went out very fast indeed. Art Nouveau had been an international style for perhaps 15 years. By the 1920s, it was not merely unfashionable. It had become a symbol of everything a new generation of designers had organized itself against. The whole logic of the age was changing, toward the machine, the straight line, the unornamented plane, the idea that a lamp should look like what it does rather than like a wisteria. Tiffany's work was, by every criterion of the new taste, wrong. It was handmade, which was inefficient. It was ornamental, which was dishonest. It was drawn from nature, which was sentimental. It was expensive, which was indefensible. Within a decade, the most admired objects in America came out of a vocabulary that had no room whatsoever for a leaded shade of dragonflies. He did not adapt, and there is no sign that he seriously considered it. He was in his 70s. He had constructed an entire philosophy of design, and he continued to produce work in it with a conviction that his contemporaries increasingly described as stubbornness. There was a second problem, and it was structural rather than aesthetic. Everything Tiffany Studios made was made by hand, by trained people, one object at a time. A leaded shade contained hundreds or thousands of individually chosen and individually cut pieces of glass, each wrapped in copper foil and soldered. It could not be stamped, molded, or produced on a line. That had been the boast of the enterprise for 30 years, and it became, quite suddenly, the fatal weakness. The labor cost per object could not be reduced, and the objects were competing against factory lighting that cost a fraction of the price and looked, to a young eye in 1925, considerably more modern. He had built a workshop on the economics of a medieval guild inside a country that had just invented mass production, and the base of the business, the memorial windows, was going with the rest. Church building slowed, then stopped. The Gothic revival gave way to plainer interiors. Congregations that had spent 40 years filling their walls with colored glass began, in the 1920s, to regard that glass as dark, cluttered, and Victorian. The orders fell away. Then in the autumn of 1929, the market for expensive decorative objects ceased to exist altogether, and what remained of the studio's order book went with it. On the 16th of April 1932, Tiffany Studios filed a petition in bankruptcy. The report ran in the New York papers the following morning. It was a comprehensive and public humiliation for a man of 84 whose father had spent 65 years being described as the most successful merchant in America. And it happened while the jewelry house on Fifth Avenue, which carried the same surname and which he had declined to run, went on trading through the Depression without interruption. He did not go quietly. 2 months after the filing, he announced that he would continue his work through a successor corporation carrying his own initials. And it did in fact go on producing ecclesiastical windows and memorials for a while afterwards. But the studios themselves were finished. The contents were auctioned. The remaining stock of Favril glass and art objects was sold in a lot to an auctioneer, and then advertised in the newspapers as a liquidation. His industrial arts library was disposed of to the New York City Board of Education, which put it in a school. Louis Comfort Tiffany died on the 17th of January, 1933 of pneumonia at the top of the great dark house on 72nd Street that he had designed for his father almost 50 years earlier. He was 1 month short of his 85th birthday. He had outlived both his wives, one of his daughters, the style he had helped invent, and the company that carried his name. He was buried at Greenwood in Brooklyn, in the same ground as his father. 3 years later, the family sold the Madison Avenue house to a developer, and it was pulled down to make room for an apartment building. What happened to Laurelton Hall over the next 24 years is the part of the story that people find hardest to accept. The foundation kept the artist's residency running through the 1930s and the war years, but the arithmetic was impossible. The house had been built as an expression, not as a property. It consumed money simply by standing there, and the endowment was being eaten by maintenance on a scale that no institution could carry through a depression and a world war. In 1946, the trustees took the decision that trustees eventually take. The residency was closed. The estate would be sold, and the proceeds turned into grants, so that the foundation could go on doing the thing it existed to do without the building that had inspired it. The contents were dispersed at auction. Windows, panels, lamps, and fittings that had been assembled over 4 decades as a single composition were separated into lots and sold to whoever turned up. The land was divided into parcels. The house stood empty. For the better part of a decade, Laurelton Hall was simply an abandoned mansion in a country that had thousands of them and no interest in any. That is the essential context for what happened in 1957, and it is why the fire is not really the tragedy of the story. The fire was a conclusion. On a night in that year, the empty house burned, and by morning, most of it was gone. The 84 rooms, the interiors, the fountains, the sequences of colored light that a man had spent 3 years and $2 million composing. To understand why nobody stopped any of it, you have to understand how completely the reputation had gone. In the 20 years after Louis Comfort Tiffany's death, his work was not merely unfashionable. It was regarded by people who considered themselves serious about design as an embarrassment, the emblem of a vulgar, overstuffed, morally suspect era that modern America had grown out of. Museums did not collect it. Universities taught the 20th century as a story of purification in which he was the thing being purified away. The consequences were physical. Churches across the country, remodeling in the plainer taste of the 1940s and 50s, took out their memorial windows and disposed of them. Some were sold for the value of the lead. Some went into skips. There are documented cases of windows being broken up because no one could be found who wanted them. Every one of those windows had been paid for by a family in order that a name would be remembered. The names went into landfill along with the glass. The lamps went the same way. Dealers in New York in the 1950s could not shift them. They turned up in junk shops, in the back rooms of house clearances, at prices that would not now buy a single piece of the glass in one. The received opinion of the period was that they were period bric-a-brac of no consequence. That is the world in which an 84-room house of colored light could sit empty on a Long Island bluff for a decade with nobody sufficiently interested to intervene. It was one of Tiffany's daughters who telephoned the news to a couple in Florida. Hugh McKean had come to Laurelton Hall in 1930 as a young art student on one of the foundation's residencies, one of the very people the whole institution had been created for. He had spent a summer there in the last years of Tiffany's life. He was now an art professor in Winter Park, married to Jeanette Genius, who had established a small gallery on the college campus, and the two of them had mounted, 2 years earlier, the first significant exhibition of Tiffany's work since his death, at a moment when the market considered it worthless and the museums considered it an embarrassment. They drove north and walked through the ruins. What Jeanette McKean said, standing in the wreckage, was that they should buy everything that was left and try to save it. They did. Windows, columns, mosaics, panels, architectural fragments, the Daffodil Terrace, the chapel from the Chicago Fair. The surviving material was bought, crated, and taken to Florida, where it became the core of a collection that is now the most comprehensive holding of Louis Comfort Tiffany's work anywhere in the world. The rescue was carried out by a man whose entire connection to Tiffany was that Tiffany had once, at the age of 82, paid for him to spend a summer making art. The foundation itself never stopped. It let the house go, converted to grant making, went on buying work from young artists and pairing them with masters, and it is still awarding grants today. The oldest artist-endowed foundation in America, more than a century old, the only one of Louis Comfort Tiffany's institutions that outlived him intact. At the head of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, there is a shop, and it is one of the most recognized commercial addresses on earth. The color on its boxes is the property of the company. The name on the front is the name of a Connecticut cotton manufacturer's son who took less than $5 on his first day of trading in the autumn of 1837. Charles Louis Tiffany, 1. That is the plain reading, and it is not wrong. He built an institution that has now outlasted him by more than a century and 200 owners' worth of economic weather. He gave the English language a word. He gave the engagement ring its shape. He acquired a stone he refused ever to sell, and the stone is still there, still unsold, still doing precisely the job he assigned it in 1878. His method: fix the price, guarantee the quality, attach the name, never explain, is the operating manual of the entire modern luxury industry, and almost nobody standing on that pavement could tell you a single thing about him. His son lost. That is the plain reading of the other life. The studios went bankrupt. The house burned. The style was buried for 30 years so completely that in the 1950s his windows were being taken out of churches and thrown away, and dealers in New York could not give the lamps house room. The screen in the White House was auctioned off by a president who thought it in poor taste. The great mansion on Madison Avenue came down for an apartment block. And yet every serious museum of American art now competes for what he made. The lamps that could not be sold in 1950 are among the most valuable decorative objects of the 20th century. The word Tiffany, spoken in a sale room, means the son and not the father. The two men had spent their lives on opposite sides of a single question, which was whether the point of a beautiful object is that it lasts. The father said yes and built accordingly, in stone and metal, and was proved right. The son said no and built in something that breaks, and was also proved right, in a way that took an additional half-century and required a fire. There is something almost cruel in the shape of it, and it is worth stating precisely. Charles Louis Tiffany wanted permanence and achieved it, but the permanence he achieved was for a shop, a color, and a method of selling, and not for himself. He is a footnote in the history of a brand he spent 65 years being. Nobody visits his grave. No museum reconstructs his rooms. The most durable thing he ever did was to teach an entire industry how to attach a name to an object, and the industry learned it so thoroughly that his own name became a thing people say without meaning a person at all. Louis Comfort Tiffany wanted his father's approval, so far as anyone can tell from a life spent conspicuously not asking for it and did not get it. What he got instead was posterity, the strangest and least reliable of consolations, arriving 24 years after his death, in the form of two school teachers picking through a burnt house with a truck, and the one institution either of them built that was designed from the beginning to help someone other than themselves. The foundation, set up by an old man to give young artists a summer of being taken seriously, is the one that has survived both the fire and the market without a break for more than 100 years. There is one more thing to be said, and it does not flatter either of them. The father's method was to put his own name on things other people had found, cut and made, and to sell the name. His son escaped that trade at the cost of a considerable family rupture, went to another borough, built furnaces, and constructed a workshop of more than 100 people, in which a woman from Ohio conceived some of the most reproduced designs in American history and had her employer's signature attached to every one of them. It took 100 years and a box of family letters found in 3 separate places to correct it. Neither man was cruel. Both were entirely of their period. And a son who spends 40 years insisting he is nothing like his father is, in the ordinary way of these things, describing the resemblance rather than denying it. Some inheritances, in the end, are handed down less in what a father chooses to leave behind than in what a son swears he will never become.